Crossovers are a novel concept that seem to have garnered a pretty mixed perception in contemporary media, as the idea has seemingly become more overdone and redundant in the late 2010s and 2020s. It appears to me that video game crossover licensing has been thriving over the past handful of years, what with things like the DC x Sonic the Hedgehog partnership, Nickelodeon's re-entry into the video game industry, or dare I say, the penultimate crossover event of all time, Mario and Rabbids. That was a joke, but in all seriousness, I've actually heard they're decent games. Of course, I'd also be remiss not to mention the MCU's entire existence having thrived from the crossing over of fan-favorite characters between movies, and yet some of those among us have found themselves absolutely sick of this very idea lately because their scarcity has dwindled to a point of feeling normalized. I've begun to observe some opinions contrary to the usual hype one would expect to see for a crossover that feel underwhelmed, uninterested, or possibly even displeased. Not for me, though. For me, crossovers used to be one of the most exciting TV events of my childhood, and I still look back fondly on them even to this day. Whether it was the grim adventures of the kids next door, That's So Sweet Life with Hannah Montana, or even Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, each of these were all pretty major crossover events back when I was still a kid. And let's not forget the excitement that was the most beloved video game crossover of all time in the Super Smash Bros. Series. I'll never forget how excited I got every time I went to check that Smash Dojo website when Brawl was coming out. Aw man, those were the days. Like I said though, nowadays video game crossovers appear to be thriving, even now more than ever with all the releases that we seem to be getting year after year. Multiverses, rest in peace. Nickelodeon kart racers. There's also licensing for Minecraft or Roblox, and Nintendo does this all the time with their games too. Mario Kart 8, the previously mentioned Smash Bros., Animal Crossing has DLC. Sonic and Pac-Man did a crossover for games they released. The entire Kingdom Hearts franchise is a giant crossover that's still continuing to this day. Marvel vs. Capcom is one of the most well-known fighting game sub-series out there. I might regret bringing this one up, but even LEGO Dimensions was premised on the crossover idea. And no, those videos are not coming back. And yet, the same can't really be said for the animation and film crossovers. I mean, how many cartoon crossovers can you really name off the top of your head that came out between 2016 and 2025? First thing that came to my mind was those WWE animated movies. And even though there is an occasional Tom and Jerry meets Willy Wonka special that takes a part of the internet by storm, animated crossovers as we know it have all sort of changed. And here's what I mean. Traditionally, crossovers would normally consist of like two separate intellectual properties characters coming together and interacting with the others, allowing for a merger of the two worlds, right? Well, nowadays, despite crossovers still being a thing, a very common trend that I've noticed is that they've strayed away from being focused on purely two shows and have instead just become one giant conglomerate of references to a bunch of different shows all at once. And that's not to say this is a bad thing. You've got good examples where this works with things like the Lego Movie or the Jellystone crossover special, but then you've also got ones like the OKKO crossover Nexus or Chippendale Rescue Rangers, where it's just a bunch of references all over the place with a story attached along with it. Space Jam 2 is probably the most egregious example I can think of, even more so than Ready Player One, of just references to things being present for literally no reason other than being references. The entire final act where the Toons are playing against the Gooning Squad is just a mess of Warner Brothers showing off every property they own. Why are A Clockwork Orange and The Night King just dancing on the sidelines of this Warner Brothers basketball game? They're just there to be recognized by the audience. They serve no narrative purpose and don't really make sense to be present in an otherwise completely separate genre of film. And sure, if you're entertained by the spectacle of recognizing something on screen, there's nothing inherently wrong with your personal entertainment value you get out of that. And even though this sort of thing doesn't bother me the way it does many others, I do see the point that they're making when criticizing a creative choice such as this. It is potentially immersion breaking. The disbelief that so many unrelated properties could diegetically exist within the setting of this singular film is completely understandable because the sheer scope of the scenario has grown to a point where it's almost out of control. And I think of all media companies out there, Warner Brothers is the most guilty of doing this. And even though there could be specials where this collage method works, like the aforementioned Jellystone special, which I found to be a fun watch overall, it can still lead to things feeling overcrowded with so many characters being present within one narrative. A slow burn build-up can help appease this. It's why the film duo of Infinity War and Endgame were so well received after all, with the MCU having given us so many previous episodes, so to speak, that allowed us to learn who all the characters were before diving into the main event, including the villain. But just doing a standalone project like this with no pretext provides a more difficult obstacle to overcome. That's why, after having given it some thought, I've determined that while the spectacle of seeing intellectual property stew can have a short-term appeal, I tend to prefer the crossovers where only two properties collide and interact with each other, because those interactions will have a lasting effect on me later down the line. Character interaction is the absolute most interesting thing about a crossover. It's not just the fact that these characters all show up on screen together, it's the way they interact with the characters from the other property that makes it interesting and memorable. Historically speaking, Scooby-Doo has probably done this more than any other franchise out there, given the sheer number of crossovers it's had in the past however many decades, ranging from Batman to Kiss to WWE to Courage the Cowardly Dog. Speaking of which, I actually still haven't watched that special yet, despite Courage being one of my all-time favorite cartoons, so I'm gonna go do that real quick.
2 hours later.
Yeah, that was an enjoyable cartoon. But all of this to say that there is one crossover that I feel stands out above the rest when it comes to this. Not necessarily for having depth, but for the sheer genius of contrasting characters and premises that come together in a collision of two near opposite universes, create a well-made, entertaining, whimsical story between unlikely characters. Dare I say, one of the best crossover events of all time. Anybody old enough to remember watching Nickelodeon back in the mid-2000s probably has some semblance or recollection of one crossover event in particular. A TV event so prominent that so many kids from that generation probably still have several fond memories of it even to this day.
My name is Timmy! Timmy! Who's Timmy? I'm Jimmy Neutron!
Everything I know is a lie! The Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, Friday, May 7th at 8, 7 Central, on the only place that messes with the Tooniverse, Nickelodeon.
The Jimmy Timmy Power Hour. I obviously can't speak for your personal experience, but I can definitely say that when I was in school, this thing was massively popular among kids in my grade. At two different schools, no less. In 3rd grade specifically, I had to transfer to a different school my mom worked at, so when the second Power Hour special came out, I got to hear all about it there. And then when I was transferred back to my original school 1 year later in 4th grade, I got to hear about the 3rd special because we went back to school like a month after it came out. Truthfully, I think the idea of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour was genius, right down to the name. This was a crossover event between two of Nickelodeon's biggest animated series at that time, The Fairly OddParents and Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius. Shows with protagonists that have very similar sounding names, yet couldn't be further from each other in terms of personality and intelligence. And besides that, how often have you heard of a crossover event proving itself so successful that its parent company called for not one but 2 sequels to it, turning the event into an all-out triple Power Hour trilogy that provided for some neat meshing of both 2D and 3D animation. There really is nothing else like this crossover. So, with this video, I figured, you know what? I'm in the mood to review the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour trilogy. Why not make a video on it? Besides, with these specials having aired like 2 decades ago, I'm curious how many people still remember it and have fond things to say about it, and who might stumble upon this video randomly one day and be suddenly reminded that it was a thing that existed at one point when they were a kid. For me, I hadn't seen these specials since like 2007 probably, so it had been over 15 years since I'd watched them. Heck, for years, I basically forgot they were a thing at all, so getting to return back to them now when I'm good and nostalgic for them seemed like a good idea. I couldn't think of a better time to re-examine them really, considering I hardly remembered what happened in them, so hey, take a seat and come along for the ride as we dive into the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour trilogy. And hey, if you find this video interesting, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other work, especially the other tie-in video I'm making alongside this one, in which I review every single Fairly OddParents and Jimmy Neutron video game as a sort of homage to the original crossover idea that we're revisiting in this video. I'm really proud of how that video turned out, so definitely check it out. That said, let's roll. So, kicking things off with the first of the 3 Jimmy Timmy Power Hour specials, I really just want to go ahead and highlight all of the things that really made this crossover super brilliant from a conceptual perspective. Whether it's the simplicity of the fact that both characters have names that rhyme to the sheer contrast in concept between the premises of both shows, I honestly don't think that there's a better crossover Nickelodeon could have ever done. Yeah, I know SpongeBob is their big cash cow and all that, but I don't think that there's a second show from Nickelodeon that would complement SpongeBob nearly as well as the way Fairly OddParents and Jimmy Neutron do to each other. What we have here is one 2D animated cartoon focused around an average intelligence child who has the resource of magic at his fingertips to be capable of solving whatever problems he needs or having whatever fun that he seeks through his fairy godparents of Cosmo and Wanda. This show entirely revolves around magic and all the capability that it is able to generate through the various premises of the different episodes that the show had written. On the other side of the coin, we have a show completely grounded in science. Yes, Jimmy Neutron may have some wacky concepts out there and a load of creative villains and scenarios, but everything gets solved through Jimmy's own analytical, rational, superpower brain. There is no magic here that cleans up the messes. Jimmy has to solve them using his own intuition and resources at his fingertips. Magic and science. These things have conflicted with each other for centuries at this point in terms of human history and culture. On one hand, you have fantasy and imagination that were used to create ideas and explanations for things, or so much as envisioning an otherwise impossible scenario through this unexplainable method of origin. Magic has always been a hand-wavy answer to rationalizing the irrational, whereas science is 100% rational and aims to describe and explain how everything works through logic, reasoning, and tangible cause and effect. Science seeks to answer, whereas magic shrugs off the explanation. These things are at odds with each other, and while some people may prefer to lead towards one over the other, they are polar opposites, and that can't be denied. So to bring together one show that is well versed in one realm and another show that's versed in the other and have them cross over just seems like the perfect idea. Then of course there's the main appeal that everybody that I knew as a kid loved about the show, which was the fact that one show was a 3D animated series produced by DNA Productions, whereas the other was a 2D animated series produced by Frederator. And in this special, the characters cross over with the other, and we get to see what Timmy Turner looks like in 3D and Jimmy Neutron looks like in 2D as we witness the characters enter into the other's dimension. I don't really know if Dimsdale and Retroville are just on opposite sides of the planet or how that works, because the show describes the existence of both worlds as being different dimensions within the same universe. I'm not really here to question the logistics of cartoon logic, but I'm just going to assume that they run parallel to each other because, as is shown in the second special, they both have a Friday the 13th dance that lands on the same day at the same time, so that kind of implies that time moves consistently among both dimensions. After all, one of these shows' premises is all about magic, so I'm just going to say that this is magic and leave it at that. Of course, one other small detail is just the fact that both main characters are named Jimmy and Timmy, so the fact that the characters' names rhyme rolls really well off the tongue, and the way Nickelodeon added Power Hour to further play into the rhyming scheme just makes for an all-around great title for this series of specials. I honestly couldn't think of anything better. The intro sequence is great too because we get to see a meshing of the 2D and 3D animation within the same environment. While I do think that certain shots or moments within this intro kind of stick out given the age of the animation, it's still really cool to see, and I think they did a really great job meshing the two forms of animation together from these different studios. It really makes me appreciate the fact that Nickelodeon and the creative teams behind both shows really came together to put a lot of effort into making this the best that it could be. I really think that the hard work and effort that the staffs put into this trilogy of specials is part of the reason why it has such staying power, and a bunch of people still remember this crossover so fondly all these years later, whereas many crossovers have passed over the years and people have sort of forgotten about them or don't really think about them as much. But enough about the premise and the concept, let's just get right into the actual special itself. So the premise of this one is pretty straightforward. As established by the opening scene, Timmy has an upcoming science fair project that he hasn't done because he was too busy playing video games, and so he needs to find a way to come up with a science fair project the very next day so that he doesn't fail the class. As a result of this predicament he put himself in, he wishes for Cosmo and Wanda to send him to the greatest lab in the universe, which just so happens to be Jimmy Neutron's lab over in Retroville.
Look, Baron Von Bighead, get off my back, which is now bulgy. Listen closely, Beaver Boy.
What I appreciate so much about this first episode is that rather than have the two characters just sort of meet and get along and become instant friends, they're actually completely at odds with one another. Timmy's recklessness and lack of intelligence completely contrasts with Jimmy's more reserved and well-structured approach to most of his problems. So of course, these two characters wouldn't immediately see eye to eye and get along because their way of thinking and approaching situations are complete opposites from one another. I love how this falls in line with the exact same idea of magic and science being at odds with one another, and it is a perfect parallel to the premises of the shows to have these characters conflict. Unfortunately for Jimmy, he ends up confusing one of his laser pens for Timmy's wand that poofs him back to his room, and Jimmy ends up getting switched over to Dimsdale, creating the main premise of the first special. These are essentially two parallel fish out of water stories in which the main character of each show swaps into the other's world, and we get to see how each of them handle the rules of each world and a personal problem that matters to the other main character of the original show. In Timmy's case, he ends up booting up a violent video game into Jimmy's dog Goddard, who then begins terrorizing the people of Retroville, eventually becoming a giant robotic monster that Timmy needs to put a stop to. On the flip side, Jimmy ends up running into Cosmo and Wanda, who he misinterprets into being computer programs because he doesn't believe in magic, and the concept of fairies is completely lost on him, which I can actually appreciate and think is a good way of them essentially making it so that Jimmy doesn't find out that they are Timmy's fairy godparents, you know what I mean? I can actually buy this excuse of Jimmy being able to interact with Timmy's fairies and not even comprehend that fairy godparents are a thing, because it's completely inconceivable to a scientist brain like him who only deals with the realm of rationality. Magic isn't even a sliver of a possibility to Jimmy because everything has to have a scientific explanation behind it. But the problem Jimmy faces is dealing with Crocker, who manages to get them both teleported over to Fairy World, where Crocker can take over and rule Fairy World as their king, finally getting the proof that he's been looking for so long. I really love the fact that the special manages to find a commonality between Timmy and Jimmy through the things that they care about, even though personality-wise the two would never see eye to eye. Jimmy's attitude especially seems to come across as though he does not care about Timmy's fairies in the slightest at first, and it's only when he recontacts Timmy and sees Goddard that it clicks for him. I think that's probably my favorite part of the entire episode, is how it showcases these two people from entirely different lives coming to understand that just because these people they barely know are in trouble, it doesn't mean that there isn't somebody else out there that cares about them. I've heard some people complain about things like pacing and character interactions and writing and the like, but honestly, I don't really have anything negative to say about any of these factors when it comes to the first Power Hour episode. I will say that of the three growing up, this was my least favorite of them all, but I think that was mostly just due to the fact that I was exposed to it less than the other two episodes, which seemed to air a lot when they had come out initially. That, and the fact that when the first one premiered, I wasn't exactly in the know on it being a big event, because I must have just missed those commercials. Whereas after having seen the first one, I made a bigger deal as a kid myself over the second and third specials because I already knew about the first one. Granted, I did see it the weekend that it premiered, it's just I didn't know it was a thing and I just happened to be there. But honestly, I kinda do appreciate the fact that these specials are paced a little bit slower because the main idea here is just to see how Timmy reacts to Retroville and the characters within it, while Jimmy reacts to Dimsdale and the characters within there. These people get to see what it's like to live the life of the other person, and I think that's a pretty eye-opening experience.
No, but that's not all. Plus, since you're Turner, you get this series of vicious beatings I had planned for you today.
I mean, you've probably heard the phrase imagine being in their shoes before, and this basically makes that literal. It's almost the equivalent of a body swap in a figurative sense because most of the characters in both worlds seem to somehow confuse Jimmy and Timmy for being the other person. For example, Carl and Sheen end up calling Timmy small-headed Jimmy because they think that Jimmy shrunk his head in some sort of science experiment. In fact, Cindy seems to be the only character that realizes Timmy is a different person in the Jimmy Neutron world. Meanwhile, on the Fairly Odd Parents side, Timmy's friends and father think that Jimmy is just another one of Timmy's costumes as an excuse to get out of something like Buzz Adams, a former attempt at a disguise that Timmy had used.
And the time you didn't want to go to the dentist and you were Buzz Adams? Oh, that's rich!
Admittedly, I've never been a fan of this trope where the characters are too stupid to realize somebody is not who they think they are. I mean, another key example of this is when people confuse Silver or Shadow for Sonic, like in Sonic 06. I know it's an easy game to take potshots at, but like seriously, how does Elise look at Silver and think Sonic is the same character? I've seen people criticize the special for leaning more into the Fairly Odd Parents side of writing compared to the Jimmy Neutron side, and while I do also see that, it doesn't really bother me too much, even though I can admit that the Jimmy Neutron characters tend to become more and more mischaracterized with each special that passes. And I'm sure this will get brought up again as we get into the other specials, but personally speaking, it doesn't really bother me all that much. Maybe it's just because I haven't watched through both shows in many years at this point to where I have vague memories of what the shows were like as opposed to fresh ones. But watching the special on its own, this one in particular, it didn't really bother me at all. The special has some pretty good gags, and I just get a pure sense of enjoyment watching all the characters from these two different shows all coexist together. It is sort of silly to me that Timmy is finally able to get the attention of a girl through Cindy when he has absolutely zero luck with that back in his own flat dimension, but it sets up an idea that is able to come back in both of the sequel episodes. I also love, as many kids probably did, seeing Timmy react to becoming 3D and Jimmy react to becoming 2D.
Whoa! Hey, why is everything so bulgy? My arms! My depth! It's gone!
Sure, maybe it's a little fourth wall breaking, but the fact that the characters have the ability to kind of observe and realize that the way they feel is different compared to what they're used to is a really amusing way to play into the animation change, and I'm here for it. A common opinion I've seemed to have noticed on the internet regarding the character designs is that everybody seems to unanimously agree that Jimmy Neutron translated into the Fairly OddParents art style perfectly, and my take isn't any different. I completely agree. Jimmy looks phenomenal in the FOP art style, almost as if he fits right in as a regular character on the show. They managed to keep the big brain exaggerated enough to not look goofy while still giving him the bigger hair to body proportions compared to the other characters, and I appreciate the detail of the small edge they added to his face to emphasize the cheeks, which he's known for having in his own usual 3D art style. Timmy, on the other hand, seems to have gotten a bit more negative rap from most people for his 3D design, given that this character was more difficult to translate from 2D to 3D. Personally speaking, I've virtually never had an issue with Timmy Turner's design in the Jimmy Neutron art style. I mean, I guess I see why people might find his design off-putting because it definitely looks strange, but I honestly think that the team that designed his 3D model did a phenomenal job capturing his appearance properly. I mean, it is sort of difficult to translate a design like this given his exaggerated teeth and head-to-body proportions compared to the Jimmy Neutron cast, which still have larger heads, but not quite to the extent that Timmy Turner, Cosmo, and Wanda all have in their designs. I mean, even then, Timmy does still have a shorter height than all the other characters, so it still comes across correctly, and I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Plus, his lack of a chin in the FOP design also comes across here too. I don't really see what the issue is with this model. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong here or something, but I think it looks fine. I don't really know how you would have translated this better. I think the only thing that could be improved is maybe the proportions of his head to his body, but that's a very minute difference that I really don't think would change anything in the grand scheme of things. Personally, I find that both designs work perfectly well, and I'm very impressed that both teams were able to translate the other design in such a manner. I mean, in the end, I find both character designs completely believable to have existed in the other shows previously, so they get a big thumbs up from me. In fact, the thing that I find the most jarring is actually what happens at the very end of the episode. See, Timmy never ended up creating a project for the science fair, which was the entire premise for why he ended up going to Jimmy's lab in the first place, so he's just sort of stuck without anything to present. Until Jimmy sends Goddard, that is.
Oh my!
They did some sort of weird cell shading effect with Goddard in the FOP side of animation that just sticks out to me so much though. Like, I dig the cell shading, don't get me wrong, I love cell shading, but it is jarring to watch Goddard fly around next to Principal Waxelplax because he pops off the screen so vibrantly that I can't help but notice the layering of it. Like, I'm surprised they went to the effort of creating this cell shaded look when they could have easily drawn Goddard in the plain flat 2D art style instead. I genuinely wonder what compelled them to decide to do this. I don't know if it was just an individual's creative choice or it was an attempt at creating significance in the special by blending 2D and 3D together at the end to convey the characters understanding each other by displaying a character in an in-between of the two styles. Wow, that was a mouthful. Or if I'm giving them way too much credit and it's not that deep. Honestly, it probably is the latter here, but maybe benefit of the doubt could apply. And here's a fun fact for those of you that have followed me for a long time. Anybody who's seen several of my previous videos would know that I've referred to some people from my childhood that I like to call my not blood-related cousins. I tend to especially bring them up whenever I end up talking about Battle for Bikini Bottom because they were responsible for introducing me to that game, and I went on and on about them when I talked about that in my SpongeBob videos. Well, as it turns out, my first exposure to the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour was also during a time when I was visiting my not blood-related cousins over the summer of 2004. I think I ended up seeing it the Saturday after the premiere because we were all doing something Friday night, but I distinctly recall sitting sitting in their game room, the same room where I experienced Battle for Bikini Bottom, and watching this Jimmy Timmy Power Hour special. I cannot, for the life of me, no matter how much I try to remember, if I saw this Power Hour special the same trip that I experienced Battle for Bikini Bottom for the first time. Given that Battle came out in October of 2003 and I didn't get it for the GameCube until I was in 2nd grade during February of 2005, I would have had to have been exposed to Battle for Bikini Bottom months before. So 2004 perfectly aligns with that timing. The only thing is, I cannot remember if we visited them more than once that summer, or if we only made one trip out there that year. On average, we did only end up visiting them once a year, but there were sometimes a few exception years where we visited them more than once. Granted, because of my age back then, along with the fact that I haven't been to visit them since the summer of 2009, I can't really remember anymore. But it's entirely possible given the timing of when the game came out to when my dad bought it for me in 2nd grade while I was staying home from school for a full week because I was sick. And as I said, anyone who's followed me for a while likely knows how much that game means to me. Given how I haven't thought about this Power Hour for such a long time, I really only started piecing together this possibility while working on this video. But if it's true that I discovered Battle for Bikini Bottom at the same time that I saw the first Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, then that makes that weekend visit all the more special to me. I may have traced back the exact day that I played Battle for the first time. That's unreal to me. I really took that weekend for granted as a kid. Anyways, sorry to go off on that tangent. Overall, I definitely think that the first Jimmy Timmy Power Hour still holds up as a pretty interesting cartoon crossover. And as I kind of rambled about in my intro with all the various crossovers that have come out since, I still think that this is one of the best that's ever been made purely because it nails exactly what a crossover should aim to do. This isn't just licensing. This isn't just a case where character B enters into the world of character A and everything is secluded to just one side, like Uncle Grandpa and Steven Universe, for example. No, this crossover is balanced between the two worlds and gives a fair share of focus on both Jimmy and Timmy's own scenarios that they need to overcome. The only thing that I really have to say is that there isn't a lot of flipping back and forth here. It pretty much runs like the graphic on screen with only a little bit of meshing between the two styles when Jimmy and Timmy finally make contact through Goddard, and at the end when the two characters literally cross over each other to return back to their own worlds. Wait a minute. Holy shit. They literally cross over each other. What the hell? How did I never notice that before? 10 out of 10. Bravo. Crossovers peaked with this moment right here, and from then on, there was no going back. Doesn't get better than this.
Thanks, boy genius.
Don't mention it, average kid who no one understands.
Is that Timmy? Timmy? Hi! Tell him I said hi.
Get out of my lap!
Looking good, Jimmy. No bad luck so far. My skin smells funny.
So, as I mentioned previously, the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour was so successful for Nickelodeon that they ended up ordering not just one, but 2 follow-up episodes, both of which premiered in the year of 2006. Now, I can say that while I didn't see the first Power Hour special too often on Nickelodeon, I definitely remembered how big of an event it was when it first premiered and how cool it was to see both cartoons cross over with one another. So when I started seeing bumpers and previews for the second Power Hour, I was all in on making sure that I was present and accounted for when the second one premiered in January of 2006. By this point, I was in 3rd grade, the year I attended a Catholic school despite not being Catholic because my mom got a job teaching there and my parents didn't have anyone to watch me or my sister after the bus dropped us off. Long story short, I wasn't happy there. My parents ended up finding somebody the next year, and I got to go back to public school where all my real friends were, eternally grateful that they did that for me. Anyways, the reason I bring this up is because there weren't too many cartoon events back in the day that I remember taking my school by storm. But the second Jimmy Timmy Power Hour was probably the most talked about cartoon event that had occurred during my 2005 to 2006 school year. I remember already planning on watching the episodes when it premiered live because I saw the bumpers, and I did. But for the next several weeks, I just remember everybody nonstop talking about it like every single day. The only other cartoon event that I can think of off the top of my head that carried this much attention amongst my peers for more than a day was like the Cartoon Network Invaded event in 2007. Everything else was talked about like once, and then not much further beyond that. Granted, for some reason the Naked Brothers band really took off in my school too, despite not being that successful on Nick from what I can tell, but that was live action, hence why I didn't count it. So going into the second Power Hour, this one is easily my favorite of the 3. I was just so hyped up to see this at the time and remember it totally paid off off for me for a number of reasons. I would easily say the biggest of them all is just the pure and simple fact that the crossing over happens way more in this special compared to the other two, because not only do we have the crossing over of our main characters into each respective world, but now other side characters come along for the ride as well. We get to see Cosmo, Wanda, and Jorgen von Strangle enter into Retroville, while Cindy, Libby, Sheen, Carl, and Professor Calamitous all make their way into the dimension of Dimsdale. And truthfully, just like how I expressed my opinions on Jimmy and Timmy's respective designs and the other show's art styles, I feel that the same compliments still hold true with all of the other characters. Yes, I do think Cosmo and Wanda look a little bit odd, and Jorgen seems a little odd in proportions compared to the other characters, but I think the translation of the Fairly Odd Parents designs into the 3D models came across decently well. Likewise, on the Jimmy Neutron side, I really dig all of the character designs that we got for Sheen, Libby, Carl, and Cindy. All of Jimmy's friends translated perfectly, and getting to see the full cast in the 2D art style really just feels like everything is sort of coming full circle from the first special. And I mean, it really is just the next step in evolution of this concept. With the first of the trilogy being a fish out of water where both the main characters swap worlds, the next proper step would be for the two characters to come together and also introduce some other characters into the opposing worlds, which I just think makes this middle part of the trilogy stand out among the three because it leans into the crossing over aspect the most, as it incorporates not only the main characters more into both sides of the worlds and story, but also introduces an interesting villain plotline in both, I would argue. As much as I did enjoy the first one, I do think Goddard being the problem isn't the most exciting scenario, especially in comparison to watching Crocker go to Fairy World for what was a huge moment for him in the series at the time. There's just something about both the Anti-Fairies and Professor Calamitous, an established villainous force from each show, that really makes this special feel like a bigger event than the first one, even going so far as to analyze what the villain plots are. In the case of the Anti-Fairies, Anti-Cosmo wishes to free all the Anti-Fairies so that they can take over the world because Friday the 13th is coming up, and that is the most unlucky day of the year. The fact that the Anti-Fairies' entire plan is to circle the globe and stop the Earth's rotation in order to essentially prevent the passage of time, therefore immortalizing everybody's lives into a permanent Friday the 13th, feels like such a bigger scale threat compared to what we got in the first special.
Tomorrow will never come, making every day Friday the 13th!
Why would you tell us that?
Because I know you can't stop me, fool!
Don't get me wrong, Crocker was still a threat to the fairies, but he was just one guy, whereas this threat here is an army that all the kids have to take down. Then on the flip side, we of course have Professor Calamitous, who normally isn't the most threatening villain in Jimmy's cast, but he does get a hold of some magic through the gene splicing incident between him and Jorgen von Strangle, which makes him a major threat once he gets back to Jimmy's side of the universe because now he has the power of magic, which normally does not exist in Retroville, putting him at an advantage over all of the other threats there that tend to rear their ugly heads. Of course, he doesn't understand the rules of how magic works in the Fairly Odd Parents universe, which ends up being his downfall because a lot of the stipulations end up working against Calamitous and also in favor of the other kids. That, and the fact that Calamitous literally just pulls out a giant bomb and threatens to blow everything up and flatten the world so that he can rebuild on top of it, which is a pretty serious thing. I also appreciate the special for feeling less separated than the first one did. Rather than flipping back and forth from Timmy to Jimmy to Timmy to Jimmy, we get to follow all the characters from one world to the next and then back again, which I think helps with the flow because the story doesn't feel cut into fragments that we constantly jump back and forth between. Nothing wrong with that method of presenting the story in the first special, mind you, but I just prefer the way that the second story structure is written because it's one continuous flow. Also, there's just way more character interaction, not just with Timmy and Jimmy themselves, but with Calamitous and Jorgen and Anti-Cosmo, as well as some time spent between Cosmo and Wanda and Libby, Sheen, and Carl.
Give me a TV for a head. No, I know. Make me best friends with Morgan Freeman. Now we're getting somewhere.
These are character interactions that aren't the main focus of the special, but just further add to the characters building relationships between each other as they continue to engage in the scenario that plays out. It's just the coolest thing to witness that I absolutely love these slower paced moments where the story kind of sets things aside just so we can see the goofy stuff that the characters do. The writing here is 100% Fairly Odd Parents writing though, and that shines through with a lot of the humor. Some have stated that they feel that Jimmy Neutron cast is out of character because of this, but honestly watching Carl, Sheen, and Libby wishing for things, it really didn't feel feel that way to me. Sure, maybe the Morgan Freeman thing was a little random for Sheen, but Carl wishing for llamas and Libby wishing to be a pop star just feels completely in line with their characters. I will say that I think it got a little repetitive with Timmy constantly attempting to ask Cindy to the dance, only to get interrupted by X, Y, and Z. I think we kind of got the point after the second attempt, but it just kept going a little bit longer than I remember it needing to. So I do see why some would say the middle chunk of the episode drags, and I definitely started to feel that. But it managed to pick back up just in time before it really started to become an issue for me while watching. I think one more instance would have gotten obnoxious.
Don't say anything until I see your steamy den of scientific discovery. Sorry about this, dude.
All in all, I just really love the direction that this second special took. Because while the first special was all about the differences in priority and personality between Timmy and Jimmy, now we get to see them compete for Cindy's attention, which causes them to butt heads in a more direct manner. We really get to see the magic versus science elements come into play when Jimmy and Timmy are racing each other to Cindy's house, for example, with Jimmy flying his rocket he built and using these inventions, while Timmy just wishes for a rocket to race him with. It almost feels unfair that Timmy's even able to put up a fight against Jimmy because magic is just so broken, but Jimmy does seem to have an answer for almost everything, so at the very least it doesn't feel too imbalanced in one character's favor over the other. Everything also comes together in the end when the two agree to team up and solve each other's villain problem, what with them all stopping the anti-fairies by creating so much bad luck that it can't be resisted by the anti-fairies that are circling the globe, and then of course them finding a way to separate Professor Calamitous and Jorgen von Strangle from each other after Timmy accidentally spliced them together. I also appreciate the detail that Professor Calamitous keeps cutting off Jorgen before he can explain the limitations of his magic, which ultimately leads to the downfall of Calamitous because it's what upsets Jorgen enough to be able to take over his body. Which, one detail I did forget to mention is that the special kind of hand waves away the fact that Calamitous has control of both him and Jorgen by just having him simply state that he's more evil, therefore he is able to control things, which I guess isn't the worst explanation possible, but it does sort of feel odd to me.
He's big. He's mean. Oh, he's gross.
Where's he gonna buy shirts?
Of course, Jorgen does manage to regain control through anger as discovered by Timmy when Calamitous continues to ignore Jorgen's explanations of the rules. I actually really appreciate the detail that Calamitous constantly cuts off Jorgen though, because it almost feels like Jorgen is incapable of finishing his thoughts. And anybody who's seen Jimmy Neutron would know that that's Professor Calamitous' weird quirk. He's incapable of finishing anything, whether it be an invention or so much as a sentence. I don't know if this was an intentional choice or not, but if it was, then I really appreciate that detail because it feels like a very fitting nod to the character. There are moments where both Timmy and Jimmy get to use their knowledge of their respective fields in order to solve the problems too. For example, Timmy knows how they can create a bunch of bad luck, and Jimmy uses his device in order to capture the anti-fairies. In the case of Jorgen and Calamitous, Jimmy's able to use his technology to separate the two, but they use Timmy's knowledge of how they can pretend to break the rules of magic in order to anger Jorgen von Strangle enough for him to take back control of his body. The special is balanced in a number of ways that extends far beyond just the pacing and the number of times they go to each respective world. And that's what makes me appreciate it all that much more. It really feels like the team behind the first special sat down and looked at what they did well and continued to do that, and then improved upon the weaknesses of the first special in order to make this one the best it could be. It is a proper continuation, and that even reflects in the continuity that exists between this special and the previous one through a lot of little references and allusions to the events from the previous Power Hour.
Another reality avoidance costume, eh, Timmy? Oops, I mean Buzz Adams.
You've got references to things like Buzz Adams, which is what Jimmy was called by Timmy's dad when he believed that Timmy was pretending to be somebody else in order to get out of doing his science fair project. You've got the obvious references to the characters alluding to the previous events of the first one, such as the straightforward flashbacks, Carl and Sheen calling Timmy small-headed Jimmy again when he first shows up, and Jimmy referring to Cosmo and Wanda as computer programs. I think my favorite small detail of them all, though, is actually a super subtle moment that I haven't really seen very many people ever acknowledge online, which is the fact that when Professor Calamitous acquires Jimmy's storage cube, he pulls it out while he's in the Fairly Odd Parents world, and during this time he actually pulls out the same invention that Timmy and Jimmy had to put into the cube when they first met at the very beginning of the first special. That is such an awesome detail that I completely appreciate, because they really could have chosen any invention that Jimmy had in his gallery of innovation, It's a level of continuity attention that most people probably didn't even pay attention to, but it shows that a level of care was put into making this that doesn't go unnoticed by me. Or, again, it's a coincidence. Animation-wise, I would say that this does look an edge better than the previous special, but the Power Hour special here avoided situations where they'd present a scenario of the 2D and 3D animation being on screen at the same time, outside of some superimposed shots. Honestly, given how hard the scene with Jimmy and Timmy floating in space was according to some of the behind-the-scenes footage, it makes sense that they do their best not to introduce something like that again. I think the only time in the entire special that we really see the two dimensions on screen at the same time is at the very end of the special when Timmy and Jimmy are both dancing with Cindy and they keep pulling her back and forth between the two dimensions. They also separated the screen with a 3D wave effect to mask the sides, but honestly it works fine enough as it is. Based on how hard it was for them at the time to do the first special's handshake, it only makes sense to me that they'd avoid repeating a scene like that again. I'm sure it'd be easier today with how technology has progressed than it was in 2005, but that's nothing more than mere conjecture now.
Hi, Mrs. Neutron.
Overall, as I've been praising this special for the entire section of this video, I still conclude that it's my favorite of the three. When I ran a community poll on these specials about a week before this video's release, I actually asked everybody which of the three specials was their personal favorites, and to my surprise, Part 2 came in as the majority favorite, which I wasn't really expecting because I had assumed everybody thought Part 1 was the best based on discussions I had seen online. Granted, I only had a small amount of discussions to pull from, so having an actual sample size here with this community poll really opened up my eyes to what the most popular episode is, at least based on this selection of votes. Granted, I assumed Part 3 would be the least popular, and I was completely correct. Why might that be, you may be wondering? Well, if you haven't seen the special in a while, or at all really, it's pretty easy to explain.
Boys, please! This fighting over me has got to stop!
My son of teeth and me!
So, wanna hang out? Hang out? Are you nuts? Have you gone completely mental? You wanna hang out with me, the two of us together? Maybe? Okay, sure.
Jimmy Timmy Power Hour 3, also known as the episode's specific title, The Jerkinators, really drops the ball and living up to the excitement and premise of the first two specials. The sense of connectedness that When Nerds Collide continued off of from the first one has pretty much been forgotten about outside of acknowledging the fact that Jimmy and Timmy fought over Cindy. This premise seems to just completely forget that the first two even happened and sort of goes off in a different direction that feels a little bit aimless if I'm being honest with you. I mean, yes, it's cool that we get to see Jimmy and Timmy cross over again and we get a full trilogy out of this concept, but a lot of the times people say the third part of a trilogy tends to be the weakest, and sadly the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour manages to continue following that rule. I wouldn't necessarily say I hate the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour Part 3, but to say it's my least liked would be an apt way to describe it. The basic premise of this episode is that Timmy tries to hang out with his friends Chester and AJ, but neither of them are available, so he ends up going to Retroville in order to hang out with Cindy instead. Jimmy just so happened to be looking through a dimensional machine that allows him to see what's going on in other dimensions, and coincidentally witnesses that Timmy is coming to see her, so he tries to put a stop to it. Turns out, Cindy is actually on vacation at the moment, so now Timmy and Jimmy don't have to fight over her, which instantly allows them to set their differences aside and actually hang out with one another. From then on, the two characters jump back and forth between each other's dimensions and end up fighting some villains that we have yet to see, those of course being Rich Kid Eustace Stritch and the Crimson Chin's gallery of villains, who Jimmy and Timmy managed to wipe the floor with pretty easily. This results in them deciding to create their own villain to terrorize them instead, because they're looking for more of a challenge.
Got your nose?
From here on, we have two separate plots going on, one of which focuses on Jimmy and Timmy trying to turn Shirley here, as they call him, into an actual villain, because when they created the villain, they gave him the trait of having feelings, thanks to Wanda, which apparently translated to him not being super evil. So until Jimmy and Timmy end up ditching him and he realizes that they lied to him, he doesn't put up much of a threat, and we just get to a bunch of scenarios of him pretending to be threatening, and then the opposite happens. Meanwhile, both Chester and AJ in Timmy's universe, and Carl and Sheen from Jimmy's universe, feel threatened by the fact that Jimmy and Timmy are hanging out now and have seemingly abandoned both of them. The thing that bothers me most about this plotline is that I don't think Chester and AJ have much of a leg to stand on, because they outright denied hanging out with Timmy at the very beginning of the episode and told him they were unavailable. So for them to suddenly turn around and say, hey, can we hang out now, but Timmy's made other plans, well, that's on them. I don't think there's much justification here for them to feel threatened by Jimmy because they had their chance and Timmy made other plans, which he's totally allowed to do. I do think that Carl and Sheen have a leg to stand on because at the very beginning of the episode, Jimmy outright explains how they're best friends and then seemingly and abruptly just abandons them to hang out with Timmy on a whim for no reason whatsoever, which doesn't really feel like him because he does care about Carl and Sheen a lot.
What's the big idea? Can't you see we're eating? So, we're fighting a bad guy. Yeah, I think this is a little more important.
When people say that the Jimmy Timmy Power Hours feel like Fairly Odd Parents episodes in terms of the writing, it's things like this here especially that really sort of emphasize that, because I don't feel like you would see this happen, at least in this manner, in Jimmy Neutron's actual show. It isn't until the second half of the episode where things really start to pick up because Shirley realizes that Jimmy and Timmy basically mistreated him, and he becomes the actual villain they've been wanting him to be the entire time. The main crux of the villain's arc stems from the fact that Timmy gives him the trait of being adaptable instead of adoptable, because during their initial discussion of the creation of this villain, they had talked about wanting to make him adoptable after they were finished fighting the villain so he had somewhere to go.
Why don't you make him adoptable so someone can give him a nice home when you're done playing with him?
Oh, fine. There, he's adoptable.
And honestly, this does feel like a bit of a stretch in order to make the plot work, because the way that the conversation goes just doesn't feel like a natural one, if that makes sense. It is forced in the way that the special has to create this mistake for Timmy to have made in order for the villain to actually be a threat, and I feel like you could have just written this in a different manner to where it doesn't have that uncanny discussion going on. And speaking of forced obligation, the way that Jimmy and Timmy treat Shirley in this special is honestly kind of infuriating, because they're just being jerks for literally no reason, and I wouldn't really expect Jimmy to be that way because he's normally a pretty respectful person. It feels like a blatant mischaracterization that is forced just in order for the plot to move forward, and it's really disappointing that this sort of thing exists in this special because the first two never had an element like this in their stories that felt so jarringly unnatural. I mean, there were so many opportunities where they could have just been nice to the guy and they chose to be rude for literally no reason.
Now, face the fury of... What's my name?
Huh. We never really got around to that. Yeah, it didn't seem important at the time.
I don't get why they felt the need to write the characters to be this way. I really don't. I suppose it was an attempt in order to create the villain's evil origin by having them constantly mistreat him so that his feelings get hurt and he becomes angry, but even after he starts to be a threatening villain to them, they just continue to be jerks, and it just doesn't seem like it's warranted, really. There's just all these moments where they continue to anger the dude and upset him further and further, and it's like, why couldn't they have offered to reprogram him or help him out in learning how to be a more threatening villain, you know? Then there's of course also the fact that Jimmy and Timmy are jerks to their actual friends, which causes the entire B plot. But setting all of that aside, my number one issue with this special as a whole is the fact that the first two parts did not have a scenario that could have easily been resolved simply by talking. What I mean by that is that Mr. Crocker was going to go and try to rule Fairy World, and nothing Jimmy or Timmy could say to him would change his mind. Goddard had a computer program written into him that was forcing him to terrorize Retroville. And a simple "Goddard, please stop" wouldn't have prevented that from happening because it was out of his control. Likewise, in the second special, there was no way they were going to be able to talk either Anti-Cosmo or Professor Calamitous out of enacting their evil plans for the same reason. They are just inherently evil characters that have a motive to do what they do, and talking things out wasn't going to change their mind. The main conflict of this episode is resolved simply by the characters having a conversation. None of this needed to happen or happened in a fluid way to where I could believe it, because all Jimmy and Timmy had to do was sit down and tell Shirley why they're disappointed in his performance, and maybe even teach him how to be the villain they want him to be, or offer to put that program into him. But that doesn't mean that they could have at least tried to show him what they wanted him to do, and then he could have adapted naturally to that. And it would have happened whether or not Jimmy and Timmy knew that he could. Furthermore, the first time that Shirley actually acts evil towards them, all they had to do was say, "Yes, this is what we're looking for. Please do more of this for us." And then Shirley could just do it because he would adapt. It's a little frustrating because of the A-plot conflict is basically the equivalent of shoving the square peg into the round hole. It's not really how things should go. And honestly, I don't even really care about the B-plot that much, even though Jimmy and Timmy's friend crew are completely justified in feeling upset by the fact that the two have basically abandoned them and completely forgotten about all of their feelings. I mean, Cindy even comes back at one point because I guess her vacation got canceled early or something, and she attempts to cause the boys to start fighting over her, but now that they've become better friends, they've just completely abandoned that because they're more interested in their villain fighting mission than they are a girl. So now Cindy's lumped in with everybody else.
Oh, you can bet they won't ignore me. I'm like catnip to those boys.
They poop on you in a box?
That's kitty litter, you idiot!
Also, AJ in particular has this ongoing subplot where he was going to freeze himself until the 24th century in an attempt to travel to the future, but he only froze himself for literally 1 second because Chester yanked him out of his cryo chamber as soon as he saw Timmy with somebody else. Unfortunately, that 1 second was enough time for AJ to think that he traveled into the future, and he just does not shut up about it. It's literally his entire character and all he has to contribute to the conversation. It is outright obnoxious, and I absolutely cannot stand it. The repetitiveness of AJ's uncreative attempt to justify everything going on around him as being part of the future, despite everything looking exactly the same, is so beyond stupid for a character that's supposed to be intelligent.
So I'm placing myself in suspended animation until the 24th century. There's no Timmy in the 24th century. 24th century Timmy is blowing me off? Is there no end to the surprises of the 24th century? Greetings from the 21st century. Time moves differently in the 24th century. Are you the future of mall security? Or whatever this really is in the 24th century? I love that even though you're both from the future, I'm much smarter than both of you. I want to go back to the 21st century.
Hey, short, shiny, and delusional! You're not in the future, you never left the 21st century!
It would have been far more interesting to see AJ interact with Jimmy because the two are supposed geniuses, but we never really get that at all, which just feels like a completely wasted opportunity. At the very least, we did get to see Chester and AJ in the Jimmy Neutron art style, if that matters to anybody, so that's nice, I suppose. But those are the only two new character designs in 3D other than the villain himself, which we only get to see in Retroville for like 30 seconds of the entire special, because after Jimmy and Timmy's friends all gather around and agree to go get them back together, we never see Retroville for the rest of the special, other than that one brief scene where Shirley travels there and captures all of Jimmy's town, and the very end of the episode. Again, the imbalance here is glaring, because unlike the first two specials where I feel that the animation swapping was distributed relatively evenly, this one is so heavily weighted in favor of the 2D animation that it almost makes you forget there's even a crossover going on at all. Like, in all honesty, this is just a Fairly OddParents episode featuring the Jimmy Neutron cast, because the amount of scenes that occur in Retroville this time are very limited. Which is weird, because technically there are more cuts between the 2 and 3D dimensions than the second and first special. However, the amount of runtime spent in between both universes is the most heavily weighted in Fairly OddParents' favor of any of the 3 specials. Like, yes, the second special was a little more favorable in the FOP animation style, probably because the 2D animation was easier and cheaper than the 3D at the time, but at least in terms of overall runtime, there wasn't that much of a difference, at least noticeably. Here though, it's so obviously weighted in favor of Fairly OddParents to the point that it's impossible not to notice. Now, you'll observe that I marked an asterisk down when showing you the Jerkinators' total runtime for each animation style. And the reason for that is because about halfway through the episode, the main villain creates his own dimension that is supposed to act as a hybrid between the 2D and 3D animation, which I certainly appreciate, don't get me wrong, but because the character designs are entirely the FOP ones, it just feels like more of the same with an added layer of depth.
Well, I kind of like it. Look at me, I'm as limber as a schoolgirl.
Did you know you have a mole on your ankle?
Do I know you?
Basically, it's just the 2D animations running around a 3D world, so while there is a third dimension for them to move around in, the characters' look are still the same as they have been, so it doesn't feel that interesting or impactful. I think that if the premise of this world was a mix of Jimmy and Timmy's respective animation styles, this would have been better, even if it might have been a little bit jarring because there would have been different character designs interacting with one another on screen on a greater scale. But at the same time, if they never implemented something like a handshake where characters would have to directly touch one another, I feel like you could animate it in a way that was perfectly fine and wouldn't be that big of a deal. Or, furthermore, let's pull that Goddard animation style from the ending of the first part. Why don't we have all of the Jimmy and Timmy characters enter into a new 3D cel-shaded art style that tries to emulate the style of 2 dimensions but having 3D characters? Granted, I know that was probably a lot of work to model, especially for all of the assets and character designs that they would have had to translate in, but it would feel like the final evolution in this trilogy to have both animation styles blend into one another. Oh man, what a missed opportunity.
I'm sorry, force habit. Jimmy, you idiot!
And gosh, I never really meant or intended to come across this negative before I started writing this portion of my script, but what tends to happen when I'm making videos like this is I'm writing down my stream of consciousness, my true feelings about the subject I'm talking about. They tend to formulate and come out in a way that I never really thought through in my head. It's actually a very nice way to be able to articulate my opinions through this medium because I can put everything down into writing and words and express why I do or do not like something. The reason I bring this up up is because there are aspects of the special that I do like. My favorite trait of this entire hour is the fact that Shirley goes out of his way to acknowledge that Jimmy and Timmy's friends were the only people that were nice to him, and so he explicitly doesn't do anything mean or evil to them. The fact that he has that level of acknowledgement and respect for the only people that were genuinely appreciative and sympathetic towards his feelings feels very in line with how somebody with feelings should respond. It gives him more of a human trait because he's able to recognize that, and he's not just some generic villain that hates everybody. No, he's only out to terrorize and seek revenge on those that weren't respectful of him, and I think that's entirely fair for a villain to be written that way. He sees these guys as allies, and so he doesn't go out of his way to hurt them. I mean, that's fair. And lastly, I do enjoy the way they defeat the villain is by forcing him to inadvertently adapt in a manner to make himself weaker through tricking him. The last thing he would have expected is for the people who have only been nice to him up until this point to completely flip sides and mistreat him just like everybody else. And so that was a clever way for them to take advantage of the only real upper hand they had available. Granted, I really do feel for Shirley because he is a sympathetic villain. All he really got was mistreatment throughout almost the entire special, and it just doesn't feel like any of it was justified, so his reason for being evil is completely valid. I mean, it's great that he got to open a pizza shop at the end, so that's nice and I'm happy for him, but it just feels unfulfilling.
Back off! The future girl's mine! Wow, that didn't take long. Can we establish a 3 feet rule here?
Yeah, unfulfilling. That's the word I would use to describe the finale of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour trilogy. The Jerkinators, while a completely fitting title, is a super disappointing end to an otherwise awesome crossover, and coming back to it now has made me really dislike it to the point where I don't think I'd ever want to return to this special again, unless it was completely out of obligation or a friend of mine wanted to watch all 3 parts or something. It's weird to think about because when I was younger, I liked this one more than the first one, but now my opinion on that has completely flipped. I'd much rather just take the ending of the second episode where the two dance with Cindy and pretend that's the happy ending and that they don't cross over ever again. I mean, the third part does feel disconnected enough from the other two that you basically can just call it there. And there are no real ramifications of just pretending the third one doesn't exist, so that's probably what I'm gonna do from now on. Overall, despite the lackluster ending to Nickelodeon's biggest crossover event of all time, I still love and appreciate the specials for even existing because it's still such a cool concept and it brought so much entertainment out of me and all of my friends when I was younger. I mean, it still had a lasting impact that I reflect upon even to this day, which is part of the reason why I even made this video in the first place. So I would agree with the consensus that Jimmy Timmy Power Hour is one of the best crossovers of all time. Hopefully this video was a nice little walk down memory lane for those of you that grew up with this special just like I did. Or maybe some of you that have never seen these specials before and this video is an introduction to them for the first time. If that's the case, I can highly recommend watching the first 2 specials without a shadow of a doubt. I think they're both fantastic. It's the third one that I would say, enter at your own risk. That being said, if you're looking for some more Jimmy Neutron and Fairly Odd Parents video entertainment, be sure to check out my other video I made on all of the Jimmy Neutron and Fairly Odd Parents video games. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I worked on that one simultaneously to this one. Who knows, maybe you'll even find a video game that you might enjoy playing that you didn't know about before. As always, don't forget to subscribe in case you haven't already so you don't miss any future videos, and until next time, Shadowstreak signing off.